Thank you so much for joining our podcast today. I am Nondwe, your host, and this is another episode of the Aporde and IPPM podcast. Tips Talks. We are having a session this week with Aporde, which allows talented academics, policymakers, and civil society representatives from across the African continent to gain access to alternatives to mainstream thinking on development issues, to be equipped in a way that will foster original thinking. This show really delves into the fascinating world of economics and its impact on global development. As your host today, I introduce an esteemed guest, Dr. Adeyemi Dipeolu. Hope I said that right, who is an economist, diplomat, and public administrator. He has served as special advisor to the President on economic matters in the Office of the Vice President, Osinbajo of Nigeria. Prior to this, Dr. Dipeolu was at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, where he served as coordinator of the Africa Trade Policy Center, Chief of Staff, and Director of the Capacity Development Division. He has led work on Transformative Industrial Policy, on conflict and development in Africa, and he was the Head of Secretariat of the high-level panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa and lead author of its final report. So I won't go too much into his bio. I think introduce yourself to our listeners. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I think you've introduced me well enough, except to say that I have a very great passion for development in Africa, and I think it's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to come to our pod regularly to share views with the upcoming generation of African policymakers and development thinkers.
Why did you choose economics? As a Nigerian working in so many parts of the world, what was the driving force for you to say, let me impart my knowledge or impart solutions through economics?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, and it comes from, I think, having from a very young age a strong sense of wanting to contribute to African development. And then I discovered that one of the best ways of doing that was first by understanding economic development. So even as an economics student, I took development courses. But one of the things that also occurred to me is that a lot of what influences development in Africa happens from abroad. So again, one of the things I did as a student was international economics. And so for me, joining the Foreign Service was a natural progression to where economic development meets international relations system, so to speak. And so based on that background, I chose to work in the Foreign Service. And in the Foreign Service, I was mostly deployed in two areas. First, in the international economic areas, trade, investment, economic cooperation, but also in African affairs. So I worked in Addis Ababa, I worked in South Africa in the Nigerian embassy in both countries, apart from working at the UN in Geneva on development issues. So the career has been shaped, fortunately for me, around the things that interest me.
Oh, that's everybody's dream, to live a career of passion. And so where do you currently reside?
Yes, so I've been back in Abuja since 2015. Okay. When I left the UN, I went to work as special advisor on economic affairs. And when the administration left last year, I stayed behind in Abuja.
Lovely. And when you were in Africa and diaspora, what were the stark differences in development that you could visually see between the countries you were in that were more developed than your own country?
That's a very interesting question. Let me take it from a different direction. I lived in Ethiopia twice.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a very instructive experience. Because my first time in Ethiopia was in the mid-80s. I was posted to serve there in 1986. Just not long after, you had songs like We Are the World, The Great Famine.
Yeah.
And when I was living in 89, it was still a pretty difficult place in terms of shortages, in terms of political repression. So when I went back in 2005, there had been a bit of a difference from 1989 when I left. And improvements, but by the time I was living in 2015, it was totally transformed.
That's
and
amazing.
so one of the things that struck me was that I wish I was into photography, because I would have taken pictures of 86, 89, 2005, and 2015. And I'm told that today, even greater changes have happened.
What? And what would that picture look like?
Basically, modernization. Wider roads, much wider roads you used to know as thin and narrow, and maintained through artisanal means, become wide highways, overhead bridges, infrastructure. There's a light train that goes through the town, hotel chains popping up and down. In 1986, there were only 2-3 main hotels, all owned by the state. And we used to scramble to find accommodation for our presidents when they came for AU meetings. So it really transformed. But in the interregnum between 86 and 2005, I happened to serve in South Africa as well. And I spent almost 5 years here. And the most striking thing when I got here, at least in the more modern cities, was the high state of infrastructure, and almost urbanized and almost westernized, so to speak. Of course, having spent a bit more time and I went to more of the rural areas, I realized that there were disparities, but at least there was, at least on the continent at that time, there were places that looked like they could very well be any part of Western Europe.
That is true. I'm from the Eastern Cape and we still live a very undignified, unequal lack of infrastructure. So it's quite interesting that you talk about those disparities. What makes an unequal, state of development in societies, in your opinion?
Again, I think another fascinating question. And the reason is that it's something I've been reflecting on quite a bit. That what is it that enables some parts of society to live in such splendor with so much resources, and the bulk of society wallow almost in poverty? And I think that the solutions come, first and foremost, from a value system in which the leadership of the country sees inequality as intolerable, and therefore they introduce policies to attack inequality at the root, one of which is making sure that people have jobs. And once you have jobs, you have an income. The second is to provide social services of high quality in education and in health that enables someone that doesn't have material liquidity to at least benefit from the progress that science has brought to our lives. And thirdly, through the financial system, to ensure that the tax system is used in a way that helps society to grow. Don't kill businesses with tax, but make sure they pay their fair share of taxes, and make sure all citizens who earn above a particular threshold also pay their fair share of taxes so they can help pay for the services that will help to improve the lot of ordinary people.
This is a very interesting debate. What do you think then could be some priorities that African countries can look at in terms of developing the economy?
Two things. I think whether we like it or not, we have to prioritize industrialization. And the reason is that industrialization, properly done, brings jobs.
Yes.
Helps to have exports, which you need to pay for imports. So you need to generate foreign exchange to pay for all the things that you have to import, including raw materials and equipment for your manufacturing plants. So I would say prioritize industrial policy, especially manufacturing, which also brings you skills, exposes the economy to the different areas of growth globally. But that must be matched by agriculture, but not rudimentary peasant agriculture, but the kind of agriculture we've been listening to at Aporde, where people like Chris Kramer have been talking about the industrialization of freshness. The whole idea of increasing the value addition and improving the agricultural produce, which then begins to show some of the attributes of manufacturing, the deployment of technology, economies of scale, exporting, and helping to overcome the foreign exchange constraints. So yes, I would say if we do those two things and strengthen the state capacity to raise resources, to pay for social services and uplifting of the general population, then I think we'll be on to a good thing.
That is really a goal for South Africa as well. So you had a chat with some of the Aporde team on the fireside, conversations with a practitioner. Can you give us a little insight into the gossip that you had with them?
Yes, well, I emphasized two things. I said first, personal development, and secondly, helping to strengthen the systems in which you work. By personal development, I was talking about, you first of all have to acquire skills, but also understand the processes of where you work. So if you work in a bureaucracy or in a company, understand their rules, understand the precedents, read the records, get into the ecosystem, understand how it works, but also bring some skills to the table. So if you work, say, in international trade, by all means learn to be a negotiator, because half of international trade is negotiations, even amongst yourselves. So just acquiring skills, I think, is one way. The other thing about personal development, I think, is specialization. Bring something to the table. If you're an industrial economics, understand industrial policy. If you're a monetary economist, understand monetary policy. If you work on social welfare, whatever it is, but bring a skill to the table by self-development. Go to school if you must, read if you must, listen to podcasts if you must. But the other thing is that you must try to make a positive impact in your own space. So you find very often that you say, look, I can't change anything. You can, even in your own space. The little you can do, the example I gave them yesterday was, I said when I was director at ECA, I helped to develop the publication called Transformative Industrial Policy in Africa, which we worked with Hajun Chang on. And quite a number of lecturers have said, that textbook is what I use to drive my industrial policy courses when I'm teaching my students.
Wonderful.
But a lot of policymakers also use it to guide them to understand. So that I thought was impacting on your space. Another one was, as I said, I was the head of the Secretariat of the Mbeki panel, the high-level panel on illicit financial flows. And in that process, the report of that panel has led now to the fact that the UN, for the first time, is leading on international tax negotiations. And the OECD is not too pleased, but I'm sure they'll come around and we'll all work together. So I'm just example of how you can impact in your own space without necessarily saying that I haven't changed the world. You've made the contribution even to the way people think and approach issues. The thought said I said, and I told them, and I meant it seriously, read widely, because the only way you can learn from economic development, what did they do in Korea? What did they do in India? What did they do in Brazil?
And
what have they done in South? And then apply it, yes. But in reading, you also have to listen. You're working for people, you're a policy maker. It's not your personal business. So you need to know
what the people.
What do my constituents want? Your constituents are not just individuals. Companies are your constituents.
Yes.
Labor unions are your constituents. Private philanthropies are but they may have different competing interests. But listen, understand, see where the shoe pinches. I think Peter Evans, called the process embeddedness of government working closely, particularly with the private sector, to understand the challenges that businesses face. Then the last thing I told them is to find strategies for cancelling noise. There's so much coming at you all over the world, especially in this era of social media. So the basic advice I said, stay focused on what you do best. That's not to say you shouldn't crack jokes with your friends. That's not to say you shouldn't go for entertainment or parties. But in what you do best, focus on it. And the second was help to strengthen the systems where you work. Understand that politics matters. It's not enough for a politician to say, when I gave him, he said, it's not my political interest. It's your job to go and help him to align the two. So you take a process to the governor or minister. You say, it's taking too long, I'll be out of office. Find something that he can do that will contribute to that outcome, but will also help him feel that I've made a difference. Promote coordination. I want to end there. I think it's the most important thing. You need to coordinate between various levels and across sectors. So there's no point, and someone brought it out in our conversation, that here we are trying to give incentives in a special economic zone, but the customs people are not buying into it. And I'm saying, because they are not coordinated. If there was coordination through some planning mechanism, then everybody signed on to it, and the person understands that I need to do this, not because I need to raise revenues, but because I need to create jobs. And we are all committed to creating jobs. So whatever helps to create jobs, I'm going to help that process. But if you don't coordinate, the guy just says, I'm in charge of revenue, I don't know what you're talking about, all I want is money. So that coordination mechanism, I think, is very important. And finally, of course, I said scan the horizon, help to anticipate problems that are coming and begin to help think of the solutions that can be put in place by government.
Sure. That is a big ask of these future leaders. These future leaders coming onto this DLD program, a lot of what we discussed in the IPPM group, we had Handai in the room for the first time. And that was a great way for us to show that collaboration with the ecosystem is just as important, and knowing that they are not the enemy. Yes, they are profit-driven, but they are not the enemy.
Exactly.
We all have one goal, and that's the development of Africa. This brings us to the end of our insightful conversation. Do you have any last closing remarks where you can just give us a little bit of hope for this continent?
Yes. Basically, to say that the road may look rough, but it is said that if the road does not look rough, you really are not embarking on a journey. So I would say stay positive, remain optimistic, but most important, contribute your bit wherever you find yourself. Thank you.
Grow where you are planted. Those are the wise words of Dr. Adeyemi. We are so grateful for you sharing your insightful, enlightening perspective on development economics. To our listeners, thank you for joining this episode of Tips Talk. We hope you found these discussions just as insightful as I did, and we want to continue the conversation. Please feel free to reach out to us on the Aporde website as well as the Aporde Alumni Network. Remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your network. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging content on economics and global development. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and until next time, from me, your host, Nondwe Majundana, take care. Thank you.